Screenwriting is an art. It's all about creativity, pure freedom of expression, unrestricted by rules and formulas and equations, right? No. Though we may like to romanticize the difference between an artist and a scientist, the reality is that a lot of what makes great art, and particularly great movies, is secretly a lot of numbers. What does it mean to have too many or too few characters? How many plot threads make sense for a 2-hour film? How many twists can you reasonably include? These are all questions that separate great movies from those that are considered too bloated, messy, or chaotic. We may want to believe that there are no rules to writing a great story and that you can make anything work, and that is technically true, but there are certain near universal truths as to what numbers to structure a film around to make for a story that most people will love. Today I'm going to explain to you a concept that is the closest you can get to objectively proving a right type of storytelling. Because even though there is a tremendous range in subjective preferences in certain aspects for viewers, when it comes to the realm of numbers in storytelling, 99% of people's brains are wired to fall within the exact same range of what we like and don't like in film. So listen closely and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. So simple starting question, how many characters is too many? Well, if your goal is to get the viewer invested in the drama of your narrative, as a near absolute rule, the fewer the number of characters you focus on, the more emotionally compelling the story is likely to be. This is because an emotionally compelling story means getting the viewer invested in a character's experience in some way, such that the viewer is able to feel for them and empathize with their highs and lows. Empathy is the key, but there is a simple rule as to how human empathy works, which is that we are severely limited in our capacity for empathy. It is actually extraordinarily difficult biologically for us to focus our empathy on more than one person at a time. This is a well-known, proven psychological limitation, known as compassion fade. You've heard the saying, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. This is the essence of our capacity to empathize. We are not capable of applying empathy to many in the same way we can for a single individual. It's the same reason it is much harder to drive donations towards large-scale humanitarian crises with millions of lives at stake versus hearing about the story of one child who is suffering in that crisis. Over and over, it is proven and highly documented that people can only really latch onto and care about the story of a single individual and their struggle. The same holds true even when we get to hear multiple stories of multiple people. There is still a limit to how many individual stories we can care about. It's been proven in studies that if you tell a detailed story of a poor, starving child, and then add in the detailed story of another poor, starving child, that singular addition alone causes the amount of total donations to the children to decrease. The effect of compassion fade is so absurdly strong on the human psyche that even just increasing the number of individuals from 1 to 2 causes less investment in their stories overall. It is fundamentally harder for us to care about the story of more than one person at a time. So how does this apply to film? Well, for a narrative to be emotionally compelling, we generally need to feel emotionally invested in the characters. And it is a simple, proven truth that it is easier for us to care about the number 1 than the number 2, and certainly more than 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Now, am I saying that you can only have one character in the film? Of course not, but the question is, how many characters' stories are you trying to tell? Making a movie with a bunch of likable characters and side characters is totally fine, but likable characters are different from how many characters whose stories you are trying to get the viewer invested in. Are these other characters complementary pieces to a singular main character's story? Or is the film trying to do too much? Is it trying to write in too many arcs, too many people to care about? For example, the film that has ruled the IMDb ratings for years as the most widely beloved movie of all time is The Shawshank Redemption, which is hyper-focused on the singular story of Andy Dufresne. The hell that he experiences, the years of his life stolen from him, the injustices he endures, all leading to the final cathartic moment of him reclaiming his freedom. Red is an important character, but almost solely as a complementary piece to Andy's story. Red's arc actually gets extremely minimal focus and simply serves as a nice background thread to close out and put a bow on the film at the end. But this really is mainly the story of one man from start to finish, which is why Shawshank resonates so strongly for so many people. This moment is the climax to everything we have cared about this entire film because we have only ever cared about one thing. An individual story that draws all of our empathy and focus. And the one exception within the film itself further proves my point. A brief side plot of Brooks, an aged inmate who is released late in his life. And you know what the film does? It does not split our focus. For one segment, and only this segment, we cut away from Andy, the prison, the other characters, and we exclusively follow Brooks. We get a 5-minute separate short film within the larger film. And by devoting these 5 minutes just to this man, so that we can be solely invested in just his story, so that all our empathy can go towards just this character, that makes his death unbelievably impactful. Then, and only then, do we resume the narrative of Andy Dufresne, with Brooks' death actually now serving as a sobering reminder of what these years of prison can do to Andy if he ends up trapped here till his twilight years as well. Now, am I saying that you can only ever have good films centered around one character? No, I am simply explaining a simple truth that we are wired to be able to feel maximum compassion for one person's story at a time. And as such, a singular focus is more likely to produce an emotional response from the viewer. Now, films can certainly build your empathy for multiple characters, but this generally needs to be done very carefully, one at a time, with a great deal of time spent on the process. The first Star Wars film was really just Luke's story. Han, Leia, Obi-Wan, these were complementary pieces to Luke's journey. Han was the only one that also had a bit of an arc, but the driving emotional journey was Luke's. Han's was in the background and not that important. Now, the next film is already starting with a fully established main cast, and we're already invested in Luke's story. So now this sequel has the luxury to take half the movie and really devote that half to Han and Leia, and honestly mainly Han, his arc as a character, so that by the end of Empire Strikes Back, the film has successfully gotten the viewer strongly invested in two stories, Luke's and Han's, making for a dramatically affecting conclusion to both their narratives. So the answer I'm getting at is that even though you're going to capture the viewer's maximum empathy by making them invested in one character's story, you can still do this for multiple characters if things are done carefully, one at a time, with a significant chunk of storytelling carved out for each individual. In longer mediums, such as books or TV shows, you can really take your time to carve out compelling stories one by one for multiple characters. But the problem with films is that they're so much shorter. It's a 2-hour time limit. In those 2 hours, the fewer characters whose stories are focused on, the more emotionally resonant the film, with a general rule of thumb being the closer you get to one singular character story, the better. Series like The Avengers somewhat work because at least everyone got their own story first before being thrown together. And note how even then, it's not ever going to reach maximum empathy from the audience because there are so many characters to jump around to. Spider-Man dying at the end of an Avengers movie is sad. Spider-Man dying at the end of a Spider-Man movie, now that would be devastating. And on the opposite end of the spectrum is the dreaded, absolutely guaranteed way for a film to fail, which is trying to get viewers to care about an ensemble cast right from the start. This almost never works. No one gives a shit about ensembles. We can't feel an emotional connection to multiple characters right away, especially when they are in a group. We psychologically don't give a shit about groups. We care about individuals. Even Lord of the Rings, across 9.5 hours, really only mainly pushed the stories of these two characters, and then to a far lesser degree, these characters. So in terms of characters, I'd argue that 1 is the most important number movies should shoot for if the goal is maximum emotional effect. One individual story, one singular point to focus all the viewer's empathy. Not that more than one can't work, as it obviously can, just that it starts to get a lot trickier and more often than not fails. But if 1 is the golden number for characters' stories, what about plot threads? It's interesting that sometimes we praise narratives that have a lot going on as complex, dense, or layered. Yet for other narratives, we say that too much is going on, it's complicated or messy. So what's the difference? Well, there's another numbers concept that applies to nearly all humans: subitizing. Let's try something. How many dots are here? The answer was 9, but you probably couldn't count all those. Let's try again. This time it was 3, and you could probably tell that instantly. That's because, again, we are talking about nearly universal limits to human brain capacity. Only here it's in terms of our ability to simply be able to envision multiple items in our head. If I showed you the first image again, you could figure out it's 9 dots, but you would have to count them. Whereas at an immediate glance, you simply know that there are 3 dots here. You are not counting anything. That ability to know without counting is called subitizing. And at best, some adults can subitize up to the number 5, with the minimum comfortable number that pretty much all people can subitize up to being 3. And that is extremely interesting if you know about the importance of the number 3 in writing in general. The rule of 3 is a well-known, nearly universal preference we have in writing, ranging from everything such as phrasing, so hearing phrases like live, laugh, love, words rolling off the tongue nicely in groups of 3, to comedy, with the same joke being brought up 3 times in films for best effect, to full-on story structure, with pretty much every single Hollywood movie following a well-known, templated 3-act structure. There is something about the number 3 that is extremely comfortable and right to most of us. The world just makes sense when it is given to us in 3s, and all of this extends to plot threads as well. So why are some films' plots considered too messy or complicated? I believe that over the course of a film, a lot of that boils down to how well all of the plot threads can converge over time to get to at least that golden number of 3 or less. To start with, this is because in general, one thing we all demand of storytelling is convergence. It's fine to have a lot of pieces floating around, tons of characters, tons of plot threads, but the difference between what we call messy and chaotic storytelling versus elegantly structured storytelling is how well these numerous plot threads can begin to connect to one another. We need all the pieces of the narrative to connect and fit together in some ways. It has to feel like this isn't all chaos, but rather a brilliantly thought out array of story elements that can come together in a way that we find pleasing. That was a big draw of Game of Thrones for so many years, seeing this web of plots slowly fit together right until they got sloppy and rushed it all in the end. Now, for long-running TV series or large novels, there is a great deal of time for all of this to play out. Lots of time for fans or readers to actually take breaks and enjoy thinking about the giant array of plots and trying to connect the dots. In those mediums, a large number of plot threads can often be good. However, films are fundamentally different since we are sitting down and experiencing it all in 2 hours. That's why in films, we don't entertain chaos for that long. Too many plot threads and it's just a mess to keep track of. For example, the conclusion to the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, At World's End, famously overloaded on plot threads and plot twists and dozens of characters and betrayals and swapped allegiances and the needlessly confusing pieces of 8. It did technically all come together in the end, but it was all over the place for the majority of its runtime. However, going back to my point about subitizing, and how we are so comfortable mentally with the number 3, how the number 3 means you're not counting, you're not trying to keep track of things. Think about how curious it is that films with large casts of characters and numerous plot threads do seem to make things work by converging all their moving parts into 3 major plot threads. For example, Avengers Infinity War in theory starts with all of these unaffiliated characters and all these separate little plot threads strewn across the board, yet the film made it work by quickly converging plot threads, so that by midway through the movie we have one group that is going to make a new hammer for Thor, one group that is preparing an assault on Thanos in space, and finally one group on Earth preparing for a battle in Wakanda. No one calls Infinity War messy, because subconsciously we are actually all able to keep track of things pretty easily. It feels like there is a lot going on, but in reality it's just 3 things. We're not working to keep a long mental checklist of what all the characters are doing. Thanos himself starts with harassing Thor, then fighting these guys, then finally coming here. Similarly, the previously mentioned Lord of the Rings. In The Two Towers and Return of the King, you have lots of characters strewn across different locations. But really, things always quickly condense so that in The Two Towers, they get split up into the Ents group, the Ring group, and the Helm's Deep group. And in Return of the King, it's the Gondor group, the Rohan group, and the Ring group. You never have to keep track of more than 3 or occasionally 4 things at once. So essentially, numbers matter for film a lot. In other mediums that are more long form, you have far more leeway to take your time and develop plenty of characters, plenty of plot threads. But in film, you have 2 hours to complete a narrative. And in those 2 hours, you have to work within the constraints of how 99% of humans' brains process things, which is, we find it easiest to channel all our empathy towards one individual story. We find it easiest to keep track of up to 3 plot lines at once. And too many films fail simply because they ignore these basic concepts and try to do too much with too little time. So if you felt like you learned something and enjoyed this video, then please like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this.